They found the orchard the way most abandoned things get found in Holmes County, which is to say by accident, at the tail end of an auction nobody expected to matter, on a cold Saturday in late October, when the sale bill listed a hay baler, 3 wagons, 300 fence posts, and, almost as an afterthought near the bottom of the page, 11 acres described only as orchard ground, condition unknown. The 30 peach trees stood in 3 crooked rows behind the old Dunmore barn, bark split along the trunks in long vertical seams, the way a green stick splits when you bend it too far too fast. Sap crusted black at the wounds, and here and there a branch broken clean off under last winter's ice and never cleared away, so that the whole block had the look of something that had simply stopped being cared for on a specific day and never started again. Ansel Dunmore had planted the trees 40 years before, and had tended them the old careful way for most of that time. But Ansel had died 6 winters back, and his son Gary had no use for peaches and less patience for the labor, and so the trees had gone 6 years without a hand on them, which anyone standing at the fence line could see, and which most of the men gathered there that morning had already decided settled the matter. Eli Stoltzfus walked the rows before the bidding started, which nobody thought was worth doing, and he did not walk them the way a man walks something he is deciding whether to want. He walked them the way a man reads something. He stopped at the 9th tree in the 2nd row, pressed his thumb hard into the bark near the base, worked a small flap of it loose with his pocket knife, and looked at what was underneath for longer than the task should have taken. Then he did the same at the 4th tree, and the 17th, and one more near the end of the row that had lost most of its canopy to the ice. Dale Hutchins was leaning on the fence with a cup of coffee, watching him do it, and Dale ran the biggest commercial peach and apple operation left in that end of the county. 400 acres of trees sprayed on a schedule and picked by machine-assisted crews, and Dale had come that morning mainly for the equipment, but had his eye on the orchard ground too, figuring to bulldoze the trees and put the acreage into cover crop for the season before deciding what to do with it properly. He watched Eli Stoltzfus go tree to tree with his knife, and said, loud enough for the men near him to hear it and laugh, that he ought to save himself the trouble, that the Dunmore place had been dead longer than some of the men standing there had been married, and that a man could tell a corpse from a patient without needing to check its pulse 30 separate times. A few of the men laughed at that, not unkindly exactly, the way men laugh at a joke that confirms what they already believed. Eli did not answer him. He closed his knife, put it back in his coat pocket, and when the orchard block came up for bid near the end of the sale, he raised his hand at $1,200, and nobody bid against him, because nobody else there wanted 11 acres of what Dale Hutchins had just called a corpse. The auctioneer knocked it down to him, wrote the name Stoltzfus in the ledger, and Eli walked back to his wagon, loaded the 2 crates of grafting tools and the coil of rope he had also bought that morning, and drove home without saying anything further to anyone, which was, as far as he was concerned, the whole of it. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. Eli Stoltzfus was 42 years old that October. A broad, quiet man who ran 110 acres of corn, hay, and dairy cattle 2 miles north of the Dunmore place, in a stretch of Sugar Creek Valley, where the Amish farms and the English farms sat close enough together that a man could hear his neighbor's dog bark from 2 properties over, and where the 2 ways of living had learned, mostly, to leave each other alone with a kind of practical courtesy that did not require agreement. He had lost his wife, Rachel, 3 winters before, to a sickness that came on fast and did not leave much room for anyone to prepare, and he did not talk about that. Not because he had been told not to, but because there was nothing about it that talking would improve, and so it lived in the corner of the story, the way a support beam lives in a wall, doing its work without being looked at. He had 2 daughters, both younger than 10, raised now mostly by his sister, and by habit, and he had, until the auction, never grown anything but corn, hay, and the ordinary vegetables of a kitchen garden in his life. What he had was a father. Henry Stoltzfus had farmed the home place for 40 years before handing it to Eli. And before that, as a young man in another church district 2 counties over, Henry had kept a small peach orchard of his own, no more than 20 trees. On rented ground he'd worked for 6 years, before marriage brought him north into dairy and away from fruit entirely. Henry died 18 months before the auction, in the quiet, unhurried way old men sometimes die when their bodies simply finish. And among the things he left behind, folded into a cedar chest his widow did not open for the better part of a year, was a leather-bound farm journal running back better than 30 years, and inside the front cover, in Henry's small square hand, a single line that meant nothing to Eli's mother and everything, eventually, to Eli, which read, "A tree that looks finished is only a tree nobody has looked at closely," and Eli had read that line perhaps a dozen times in the weeks after his mother finally gave him the journal, standing at the kitchen counter after the children were down, before he ever stood at the fence line of the Dunmore orchard and pressed his thumb into the 9th tree's bark. He read further into the journal that autumn, more each night than the night before. And what he found there was not sentiment but instruction, page after page of dated entries about pruning cuts and grafting unions, and a particular practice Henry had kept faithfully every year he ran that small orchard, which was whitewashing the trunks of the peach trees each fall, before the ground froze, and again lightly each spring before the sap ran hard, a mixture of hydrated lime, water, and enough thin glue size to make the coat hold through a season of rain. One entry, dated October the 14th of a year decades gone, read exactly as follows: "Whitewash the peach trunks again before the ground froze. Ansel Dunmore says it is old women's work. Time will tell him different." Eli read that particular line 4 separate times before he understood what he was looking at, which was that his own father, as a young man, had known Ansel Dunmore, had likely farmed within a few miles of the very ground Eli would one day buy at auction, and had already, decades before, heard the same objection from the same mouth. It was not proof of anything by itself, but it was not nothing either, and Eli sat with that entry a long while before closing the journal for the night. The whitewash itself, Henry's notes explained in the plain, procedural language he used for everything, did 3 separate jobs, and Eli copied the explanation into his own new ledger, nearly word for word, because he wanted to understand the reasoning before he trusted the practice. The pale coating reflected the low winter sun off the trunk's bark, which mattered, because on clear cold days that sun could warm the south and west faces of an unprotected trunk, enough to wake the cambium layer underneath, and then a hard freeze that same night would kill that same tissue, splitting the bark open in the long vertical seams Eli had seen on nearly every Dunmore tree. An injury the county extension office called sunscald, and most orchardists simply called winter kill, though the tree was not always dead, only wounded in a way that let disease in later. The coating also sealed the bark's crevices against the peach tree borer, a moth that laid its eggs low on the trunk near the soil line, where hatching larvae tunneled into the living wood and fed there for a year or more, weakening the tree from the inside in a way no one saw until the tree simply failed to leaf out one spring. A trunk kept properly whitewashed was, by Henry's plain accounting, harder for the moth to want, and harder for a rabbit to gnaw through in a hungry January besides. And there was a third effect Henry had noticed, but not fully explained in his own words, only recorded faithfully year after year, which was that the whitewashed trees in his old orchard reliably broke bud later in the spring than the trees left bare, sometimes by the better part of a week, because the reflective coat kept the bark itself cooler through the last warm afternoons of March, delaying the tree's decision that spring had arrived. Henry had written, in an entry from early May one year, the whitewashed trees bloomed 8 days later than Ansel's did. He called it slow. I called it patient. Eli did not know yet, that October, how much that single observation would matter. He only knew that his father had written it down carefully enough, decades earlier, for a son who had never grown a peach in his life to read it and begin to understand. Preparation on the Dunmore orchard began the first week of November, before Eli told anyone beyond his own household what he intended to do with the ground. Because he had learned from his father, if nothing else, that a plan is worth having settled in your own head before it is worth defending out loud. He walked all 30 trees a second time, slower than the first, with Levi, his sister's 14-year-old boy, carrying a bucket and a notebook behind him. And at each tree Eli tested the bark with his knife, checked the base of the trunk for the sawdust like frass that marked an active borer tunnel, and sorted the trees into 3 groups written plainly into the new ledger. 22 trees showed green cambium under the test cut, which was the tissue that mattered, the living layer just beneath the bark that carried water up and sugar down, and green meant the tree, however rough it looked from the road, was still alive in the only way that counted. 14 of those 22 carried borer tunnels deep enough to worry him, evidence of moths that had been laying eggs against those trunks unchecked for 6 neglected years. 2 trees showed no green at all under the knife, dry and gray straight through, and Eli marked those for removal that same week rather than waste a season hoping otherwise. Because as his father's journal put it more than once, a dying tree and a dead tree are not the same tree, and the difference is worth the walk out to check, but a truly dead tree is still, in the end, a dead tree, and no whitewash changes that. He spent the following 2 weeks doing the unglamorous work that had to come first, and that nobody driving past on the county road would have found interesting enough to gossip about, clearing 6 years of fallen limbs and matted grass from around each trunk, pruning out the clearly dead wood so air and light could reach the live branches, and mixing his first batch of whitewash in a 50-gallon barrel behind the barn. Hydrated lime stirred slowly into water until it took on the consistency of heavy cream, with just enough glue size added to make the coat cling through a winter of rain and snowmelt instead of chalking off in the first hard shower. He painted the trunks himself, with Levi following behind refilling the bucket, working from the ground up to a height of about 18 inches on the older trees and higher still on a few of the younger ones. In the deliberate, unhurried way a man paints a fence he intends to still be looking at in 20 years. He did not tell Dale Hutchins any of this. He did not tell Peg Anderson at the sale barn counter, or Roy Kasner, who ate lunch there most Tuesdays and had once worked for the extension office before retiring, or Walt Brenneman, who farmed the section next to Hutchins and repeated most of what he heard within a day of hearing it. He simply worked the rows in the cold, gray light of early November, and by the 3rd week of it, 26 of the 30 trunks wore a coat of pale lime that caught the low sun and made the whole crooked, broken orchard look, from the county road, faintly ghostly, which was in fact exactly how it began to get talked about. The talk started, as it usually did in that part of the valley, at the lunch counter Peg Anderson ran off the side of the sale barn calf, where farmers of both kinds stopped in on a Tuesday for coffee and whatever gossip the week had produced. Walt Brenneman brought it in first, saying he'd driven past the old Dunmore place, and the whole orchard had gone white as a graveyard, trunks painted up like fence posts, and he for one didn't know what a man thought he was doing dressing up 30 dead trees for a funeral nobody had asked him to hold. Dale Hutchins, who was there most Tuesdays himself, laughed at that and said he'd heard the same. Said an Amish fellow had bought the Dunmore ground at the fall sale for next to nothing, and was out there right now trying to paint life back into trunks that had been rotting since before his own boy was born. And Roy Kasner, who had spent 30 years with the extension office before he retired and still kept up with such things out of habit, said that whitewashing peach trunks wasn't exactly new. His own grandfather had done it, but that it had mostly gone out of practice 40 years back once the chemical sprays came in and made it seem like unnecessary extra labor for uncertain benefit. Peg, refilling coffee, said somebody ought to give the man's orchard a name since it was clearly become the talk of the county, and by the 2nd week Walt had settled on calling it the Boneyard, and calling Eli himself, not unkindly, but not entirely kindly either, the Lime Man, a name that stuck fast enough that within a month half the township used it without remembering quite where it had started. Eli heard the name secondhand, from Levi, who heard it from an English boy at the feed mill, and he said nothing about it at all, which was, as it happened, the response that eventually did the most to keep the name from wounding him, since a nickname aimed at a man who never flinches tends to lose its edge faster than one that lands. The honest setbacks came that first winter, and Eli recorded them the way his father had taught him to record everything, plainly and with numbers, no softening, and no excuse-making. Of the 26 trees he had whitewashed and pruned, 4 of the 14 he'd flagged for heavy borer damage did not make it through to spring, the tunneling having gone deeper than his knife test had shown, and he pulled those 4 in March, rather than let them stand as false hope. That left 22 trees moving forward, plus the 2 he had already known were beyond saving, for a working total he wrote at the top of a fresh ledger page as 22 of 30, which was accurate, and which he did not dress up as anything better than it was. He lost a graft union on one of the young replacement whips he'd tried that same spring to a late-season squirrel, discovered the damage on a Tuesday morning, and noted it flatly. Squirrel took the graft on the north whip. We'll try again with a wire guard. April the 11th. He underestimated, that first year, how much water the trees would want in the dry weeks of July, coming off 6 years of nobody watching for it, and lost the vigor of 2 more trees to drought stress before he corrected the oversight, an error he wrote down without excuse as well. Because as Henry's journal had put it more than once regarding his own younger mistakes, you do not learn anything from a failure you refuse to write down accurately. And yet alongside the losses came the first small evidence that the practice was doing something, evidence nobody but Eli was positioned to notice yet. Because nobody but Eli was walking those rows daily with a trained eye. In an entry from the 9th of April that first spring, he wrote, "Bud break on the coated trees running 6 to 9 days behind Hutchins's block down the road." Wrote it down twice to be sure I believed it. It was not movement exactly, not yet a harvest, not yet anything a man could carry to the sale barn counter and set down as proof. But it was not nothing either, and Eli underlined the entry once, the only sentimental gesture the ledger would get from him that whole first year, and went back out to check the water lines. The visit that mattered most that second year came unannounced on a Thursday in August, when a county extension car turned up the lane, and a woman named Dr. Susan Whitfield, a fruit specialist with the State Extension Service who covered 11 counties and had heard enough talk about the whitewashed peach block to justify the drive, got out with a soil probe, a refractometer, and a clipboard, and asked if she could walk the rows. Eli said she could, and walked beside her without offering commentary he had not been asked for, answering her questions in the same flat, exact sentences he used for everything. She checked bark for insect damage the same way he had that first November, cut into a low limb to look at cambium color, and pulled a peach from a low branch to test its sugar content on the refractometer, reading the number off the little dial and writing it down herself, before asking Eli whether he kept any records of his own. He brought her the ledger. She read through it at the tailgate of her car for the better part of 20 minutes, asked him twice to confirm the bud break dates against Hutchins's block, which she knew independently, because Hutchins reported his own orchard's numbers to the extension office as a matter of routine. And, she said, finally, that the delay in bud break was consistent with what a handful of older studies had documented about reflective trunk coatings, and that she would like to come back the following spring with proper temperature loggers to confirm it against, instruments rather than memory. She was not effusive about it. She noted the borer damage that remained on a handful of trunks, told him plainly he ought to watch 2 trees in particular through the fall, and left him a card with her office number in case anything changed before her return. It was, from Eli, exactly the kind of validation he trusted most, which was to say it came from someone checking his numbers against her own, rather than simply taking his word. The season that proved the orchard to the rest of the county came the following April, in the 3rd year Eli had owned the ground, and it arrived the way hard seasons in that valley always did, without asking anyone's permission. A warm stretch in late March had brought most of the county's peach orchards into early bloom, Hutchins's 400 acres among them, blossoms fully open and vulnerable by the first week of April, and then, on the night of the 18th, a cold front dropped the temperature to 29 degrees at 5 in the morning. A hard, still, frost-heavy cold that settled into every low pocket of ground in the valley and stayed there for nearly 4 hours before sunrise burned it off. Hutchins lost his bloom entire, the extension office would later confirm, along with better than half the commercial peach acreage in that end of the county. And Walt Brenneman's smaller block besides, Eli's trees, whitewashed every fall as they had been every fall since the auction, had not yet opened their blossoms that morning, running true to the same 6 to 9 day delay Dr. Whitfield had confirmed the season before. And the frost that gutted the rest of the valley's crop passed over ground where the bloom simply had not arrived yet to be killed. Eli wrote that morning's reading down exactly as the thermometer gave it to him. 29 degrees at 5 this morning. Hutchins lost his bloom entire. Ours had not opened yet. Wrote it down and did not say anything else. He did not say anything else to anyone for several days, in fact, though he did not need to, because the contrast was visible from the county road itself, one side of the valley showing blackened, frost-killed blossoms hanging dead on the branch, and the Dunmore rose 2 miles up, standing quietly unopened and entirely fine, and a man does not need an explanation to notice that kind of difference, driving past it twice a day. The talk at Peg Anderson's counter changed color within the week. The way talk in a small community always changes once the evidence stops being deniable, moving from mockery toward the careful, half-embarrassed language people reach for when their opinion has been overtaken faster than their pride can keep up with. Walt Brenneman, who had coined the boneyard name 2 years before, said this time only that it was a strange thing, strange the timing had worked out that way, which Roy Kasner corrected mildly, saying it wasn't timing so much as it was 6 coats of lime paint over 3 autumns, and Peg said, refilling coffee for both of them, that whatever you wanted to call it, the lime man's trees were the only ones for 6 miles with a crop coming on this year. Dale Hutchins did not come to the counter that particular week, having spent it walking his own dead bloom with the same flat quiet Eli had once shown him at the auction fence, but he did come, eventually, up the Stoltzfus Lane on a Saturday morning in early May, hat in his hand, in the particular way a man holds a hat when he has come to say something he would rather not have to. He stood at the edge of the orchard for a moment before he said anything at all, and then he said, "I was wrong." 5 words and nothing more added to soften or explain them, and Eli, who had never once in 3 years defended himself to Dale Hutchins or to anyone else in the township, answered him just as plainly. "You were working from what you could see," he said. He did not gloat, and he did not let the moment stretch any longer than it needed to. Hutchins asked, after a silence, whether Eli would mind him watching how the whitewash was mixed come fall, and Eli said he would not mind that at all, and that was, as far as either man was concerned, the whole of it. The harvest that September confirmed in bushels what the frost had already shown for free. 41 bushels off 26 bearing trees, sound, well-sized fruit, sugar readings that Dr. Whitfield, back with her temperature loggers as promised, measured at 14.2 on the brick scale, 2 full points over what she said the county was calling a good year for anyone else. She wrote the orchard up formally in a short extension bulletin that fall, citing Eli's ledger entries alongside her own instrument data, careful in her wording to note that the practice was old rather than new, but that its mechanism, delayed bud break through reduced bark temperature, had simply gone unmeasured in that county for 2 generations. Word of the bulletin reached a produce buyer named Marguerite Doyle, who sourced fruit for a regional grocery co-op out of Worcester, and she drove out that October, wanting to contract the entire crop exclusively for the coming years, offering a price well above the Tuesday market rate. Eli listened to the whole proposal without interrupting her, and then told her, plainly, that he would sell her a portion each season, and gladly, but that he would not sign away the whole crop or push the orchard past what he and Levi could tend by hand, because the quality she was buying came directly from the attention he was able to give 30, now 39, trees, and that attention did not scale the way her contract wanted it to. She left with a smaller agreement than she had come for, and, by her own later account to Dr. Whitfield, more respect for the refusal than she would have had for an easy yes. By the 9th season, of the 30 trees Ansel Dunmore had planted 40 years before, 26 still stood, and Eli had grafted and layered 4 more of his own alongside them in the years between, so that the row ran 39 trees deep, every one of them coated each October in the same pale lime his father had first mixed decades earlier on, rented ground 2 counties away. Dale Hutchins whitewashed his own recovering trees that following fall, working from a mixture Eli wrote out for him on a card, and Walt Brenneman tried it on 6 of his own trees the year after that. Cautiously, the way a man tries something he once laughed at. A boy from a neighboring church district, Aaron Yoder, no older than 10, came by one Saturday that same fall while Eli and Levi were painting the last of the trunks, and asked him plainly why he bothered dressing up a tree that already looked fine, and Eli, without stopping his brushwork, told him what his own father had written down decades before he was ever born, that a tree that looks finished is only a tree nobody has looked at closely, and that the paint was not for looks at all. It was so a man would not have to guess in March what the winter had done to something underneath the bark he could not see. That evening, with the boy gone home and Levi putting the ladders away, Eli sat at the kitchen table and opened his father's journal to the last written page, and beneath Henry's old entry about Ansel Dunmore and old women's work, in his own square hand that had come, without his quite meaning it to resemble his father's, he wrote one line of his own. 26 of 30 came back, and I did not need luck. I needed a brush, some lime, and the willingness to look again in March. He closed the journal, set it back on the shelf where it had sat since the week his mother first gave it to him, and went out to the barn to check on Moth, the gray cat, who had lived in that orchard since the first spring and had a habit, the whole valley had noticed by then, of sitting most still and hunting hardest in exactly the weeks the borer moths were flying, which Eli had learned to read the way his father had once read bark, as a small, honest signal from something too plain to lie. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told the ground they're standing on isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever looked at something everybody else had already given up on and gone out to check it closer anyway, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read,